came originally as a request to speak on the ancient charges. And when it morphed, rather interesting, into a talk about the landmarks of Freemasonry. Now, I began to think that this could be a real train wreck, but I realized the opportunity and challenge that it posed was really fitting a hand into a glove. Some of the reference points that we're going to talk about go back to the 15th century, and then by all means, I'm no expert on 15th century history, particularly Masonic history. But the references that you and I carry in our Book of Constitution, I believe, may contain the secrets to the difference between the way we see each other day by day and the expectations that we have when we walk through the door of a lodge on that very first night. The ancient charges are simply the way the brethren of the 17th and 18th century saw themselves. And they thought that it was important enough to convey that image to future generations of Freemasons. The question is, if you've not read them, you will know that they are to be read at the making of a Mason. Initially, I subscribed to the idea that Masons were made in a much simpler form when we were at the beginning. And in fact, Masons were made and required to their initiation to read through the charges. Early on, in the early days of Freemasonry, there was 1 degree. And it eventually evolved to the type of 3 degrees that we see today that we're going to be talking about when we get around to dealing with the landmarks. Now, it's often said that when there's any mention of ancient charges, that it's enough. It doesn't have to be done because a summary is read at the installation. And you've all heard that, I presume. And if there's people that are not Masons in the room, I don't think there is, are there? So you all are familiar with what I'm speaking about. A summary of the ancient charges would hardly be enough for any one of us to educate a new man coming into our order, whether in the beginning days or today. So it was essential that the entire set of ancient charges be read. I've produced a paper that's being put up behind me, and I deliberately didn't put the charges in it. That's your responsibility to do with as you see fit, or not. But we've all heard, year by year, Grand Masters and representatives of our Grand Lodge talk about complications that they wish they didn't have to deal with. Particularly and often, it's about relations. Now, the ancient charges are the remedy to that. What they offer you and I is ideas on Masonic manners. Manners were simply developed a very, very long time ago because they take the awkwardness out of any encounter. They take the awkwardness out of conflict. Now, if you weren't brought up in 17th or 18th century Britain, it's not something that's taught on the street, and it's not taught in the schools. You really have to go and look at it, look for it. When you're looking at the ancient charges, the importance of them leaps out at us when we begin to realize why they were so important that they were put in the very first Constitution in 1723. Why was it so important? And why is it important enough that the Grand Lodge of Canada and the province puts them in every book of Constitution to this very day? And why are they being basically ignored? Now that's a very, very interesting puzzle. At the making of every Mason, or as the Master of the Lodge directs, once in every year. When I began to study the Constitution, I realized these instructions were right in front of me. They were the same instructions being shared But honestly, nobody had ever exposed me to the ancient charges. I had never heard them read. Now, some of you know that I've done talks on this around the province for quite some time. And almost to a man, nobody had ever heard them read. So I began to put two and two together. If we're having complications with relations, with the way we conduct ourselves, and the instructions were laid out, there seems to be a big disconnect that we're missing. This perhaps is one of the greatest secrets of Freemasonry. It's hidden right in front of us. Now, we would have to think that one of those boys were exactly the same as you and I. There is ostensibly no difference. We are all ascended from the same stock, yeah? And we partake of the same fill in the blank, the same nature. For Freemasons, it's not changed. We would get along. We would disagree. We would have conflict. Some of that conflict would be embarrassing because it would go over the top when somebody overstates a point or two. Well, there were the boys that put together the ancient charges thought enough of us, and perhaps themselves, to put those charges together so that we could have at least the opportunity to be told. Now, as a Mason, sadly, we can't walk away saying, I got into this mess, but nobody ever told me how to deal with it, because you have been. We're not little boys. Nobody comes up and taps me on the shoulder or raps me on the knuckles and says, Dale, did you do your lessons? Did you do your study? Nobody does that. The nastiness of Freemasonry is that it depends on our capacity to develop self-discipline. Nobody else does it for us. If you don't want it, don't study it. You're fed up and tired, and you see things around a lodge that isn't matching your expectations. The hard part of Freemasonry is that we are taught to step up, not to criticize our brethren, but to step up and show the model of behavior. We are taught so often to turn the other cheek, to walk away if somebody is doing something that's so uncomfortable, not to quit, not to get fed up, not to demit, but to walk away. You can't exactly say that we're lost. If I walk away from one lodge in this province, do you know how many other lodges open their doors to me? It doesn't end. You and I have that. We've given that to each other. So the ancient charges are a set of instructions. Now, I have to do something technical, so be careful here. See, we're talking about, you will no doubt have read the work of George Payne, the first Grand Master. He was presented with a manuscript without a pass before 27 of June 1721. There was no Masonic constitution for him to compare his notes. So he was working on, and we know that some of the reference points that they used came from what we know as the Cook manuscript. Now, Cook copied material that we know had been written earlier. We don't know how far beyond that is, but we know he was bringing something forward that had been written earlier and put the ideas, and part of that included the charges, into the Constitution. History and articles of Masonry, it's been known ever since the Cook manuscript. In this work, we'll attempt to enter the subtext surrounding landmarks and charges. We will go one step beyond what they are to understand why they exist. Why have these elements of the craft been used to help define us, and what do they mean? We start this journey from a dock in London in the early 18th century with an unusually well-stocked ship's library that held works to tantalize the mind of a captain. The works by Thomas Aquinas, William Shakespeare, John Milton, René Descartes, Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and of course a copy of the Bible. He navigated using an instrument invented in the Qing dynasty and used since circa 206 BC, well in use for maritime navigation by 1117. One man had already changed heaven and earth in a single day, the Polish mathematician, Nicholas Copernicus. He helped our captain factually understand his place in the universe. So today, one of the complaints we often hear is about the rapidity of change. And yet, so much of what we're discovering is ideas that have been rediscovered from a time long past. We're even being aware of the work of Copernicus having been done much earlier by the Arabs. Now, we tend not to pick up this part of world history, and that's perfectly reasonable. It's absolutely reasonable. If we were trying to assume that we could follow all of the threads that led to Freemasonry, it would and literally does take a lifetime. So here, we're just going to step over centuries of time and centuries of discovery. These fellows thought that this collection of ideas was worthy of you and I, worthy of their own time, and captured and defined the way Masons should function with each other. Since the inception of Masonic thinking, the craft has had to continue while being buffeted, by being pressured by social, religious, and political pressures. That has not stopped to this day. Sadly, there are still places in this universe, this world, where you and I would be considered criminals because of the order. You and I live in the freedoms of this great country, but it's not so for all of our brethren. So it isn't a stretch of the imagination, nor at all unique, that the ancient brethren felt strongly about passing on the rules of conduct, charges, and the elements worth saving, the landmarks particularly. Charges were so vital, and as we will see, they were embedded in the early constitutions. As we know, with the development of Freemasonry, constitutional Freemasonry had roots in Holland. And the importance of achieving a constitution at a time when organizations were considered a great risk if they had a constitutional claim, a risk to the monarch and a risk to the authority. Freemasonry established itself with constitutions. This is significant because it authenticates that we belong and we have a place and we're accountable to ourselves. This had never been done before. No group in the history of mankind had ever been accountable to itself. We'd always been accountable to a religious authority or a monarch. So today, I think we've ignored the hidden secret of how to act around ourselves because we've somehow redefined Masonry. We're a version of what we were. I have issues about this. I'll confess those issues to you. Have any of you heard about local traditions? Probably. Any of you follow local traditions? Well, I follow local traditions, but I choose to follow the local traditions that happened back in the early 18th century, early 17th century. The local traditions of those days is what became constitutional Freemasonry. They weren't making it up. We had to have some standards. Now think about it. If we didn't agree on a book of the work, if we didn't agree on an organization, and we didn't have the protection of a Grand Lodge, think about what it would be like going to different lodges. Now, I love the romantic notion that in the Scottish lodges and some of the early lodges that predated the Constitution, those men already had established practices, and they were allowed to continue. I think that gives me a wonderful romantic notion. I want to go to those lodges and see how it was done in 16th century and 17th century. But things got out of hand because all of a sudden, when people discovered how vulnerable we were, they began making up their own degrees. You and I are a trusting lot. There is nothing wrong in this world with being trusting. The majority of human beings in the world are trusting. But people came and took advantage of us. Boys, I'm from over there, and I have a degree that you haven't seen before. And for the right amount of money, I'll invest this degree on you and you and you. And before we could find out that it was full of holes, this snake oil salesman would be moving on to the next community and doing it all over again. Now, you might be able to fool a group of us once, but you're not likely to fool us twice. We don't like that. So we came up with some rules. Well, no one of us is going to go out and make sure those rules are followed. We had the common sense to look at what these guys did with a Grand Lodge. 4 lodges that started it. They weren't big, powerful lodges. Some of them hardly brought out a representative at that first meeting that we all hear about. One lodge had more of a representation than the others, not unlike what we see today. Very persuasive. But after a while, after being punched around like this and pushed around, we began to think, maybe those men that are organized can offer us some protections. As the years went by, we see the protections have grown. We weren't fully born like this in the start. This came out of necessity. How many times do we see a challenge or a change going on in the Constitution at our annual communication? And we wonder why. It's absolutely necessary. This is our franchise with Freemasonry. This is where the changes occur. You and I, and every Mason, has a say. If we're curious, we have an obligation to find out what's going on. But we've had the good sense to leave it in the hands of people to run this for us. The result, you and I have protections. Nobody comes around us anymore trying to make changes. Nobody. Because there's procedures to follow. Go and follow the procedure. We'll take a look. We'll look at seriously what you have to offer. The other thing they've done is offered us protection from some of the very nasty things that continue to be said about us. People don't necessarily trust what we do behind closed doors. One of the hardest things about that I think is Freemasons tiptoe around is why we're an order of men. Well, we're not just creatures of history. We're also creatures of our times. Now, I'm going to tell you about something that I think was influential at the time the constitutions were being written, and you decide for yourselves whether it connects with the order that we have today. It has to do with your cup of coffee. I can see as I look around the room, a few of you skipped coffee at lunch. Maybe that's a good thing. Coffee had been traded, and the most coffee was being traded into Britain in the 17th century. Toward the end of the century, there was more coffee being drank in England than anywhere else in the world. So, why would that have any bearing on you and I? Well, it has to do with your education through the penny universities. Penny universities was the term given to the very earliest coffee houses. Now, the coffee houses in London were where only men could go to have a dish of coffee for a penny. Only men were allowed. Don't know why. The result of that had to do with the development later of tea houses, but only men were allowed. And as the coffee houses grew, there were hundreds of them that grew in the city of London. Now, we don't think of London as England. London was an entity all unto itself back then, and it still is today. It's a very unusual political structure. But men would start to go to a particular coffee house because that's where their kind would go. Poets went to a certain one. Insurance underwriters went to another. Somebody doing trade in a particular goods would go to another. You could go to a coffee house where there was constant debate. The academics and the philosophers would go to their particular chosen coffee houses, but no women were allowed. So this, I think, is it was. In the times, in the area where Freemasonry was developing, this is where the men would go, to the penny universities. And they would go day and night. In those coffee houses, some of the patrons became unruly. And it wasn't unusual for people to go over the top and have a dust-up. And they would be turfed out. Now, that would probably be on the minds of you and I if we were starting to construct an organization. Probably more to do with the culture of the times rather than a deliberate decision that women aren't going to be allowed. It was simply the culture of the day. Women aren't allowed in coffee houses. No big thing for them not to be allowed in a Masonic lodge. Today we look at it altogether different. Coffee houses in France did admit women. Different reason, different culture. And to this day we still see that commingling in lodges. Different times, different culture. No deliberate act of omission, no misogyny. So the solutions aren't that simple, but they're in front of us. I found something from, of course, I'm going to use references that make my point. I found some work from Freemasonry in Canada in 1915. It's a history of Freemasonry in Canada. It is fun. When the Constitution, they say, was improved, there was a line telling us this was important. So I've put down some of it, just lifted it out. We do ordain that these shall be received in every particular lodge under our cognizance. That was 1915 they were saying these things. Now, from that period to this, interest seems to have dropped off. And so, as soon as it drops off, we see more and more of the kind of tensions and the kind of dynamic that they were intended to avoid. Is this going to mean a wholesale reschooling of Freemasons? No, my goodness, no. That would be embarrassing. The way we operate is by the individual influence, the development of the man. But I don't want to talk all about that and not about landmarks. I swallowed my gum when I saw that Charlie had put me down to talk about the ancient landmarks. I consider this one of the most thrilling, frightening discussions amongst Masons that I could ever imagine. How many are there? Why are there? Who agrees on them? So, is there 3? Is there 10? So I went for the mother lode. I got a book. I found a book that is very old school. And let me see if I can get it up here. There we go. We'll talk about Churton. Simply saying this is how we saw ourselves. There we go. This is from a really, really interesting book edited by a guy named E.R. Johnston, 1930. And what he did was he put down a whole list of landmarks that the likes I'd never seen, but as I read them, they all made perfect sense. Now, I'm going to circle back very quickly to explain what I think was the reasoning that Grand Lodge never defined them. Do we have ancient landmarks defined? Here's the reasons why, I think. You think about them, there's 25 of them, according to Johnston. Now, modes of recognition makes sense. Division of symbolic Freemasonry into 3 degrees makes sense. Now you scoot through them. Legend of the 3rd degree. Boundaries from the time of antiquity were ways of defining property. And I understand the early Jewish state made sure that this would be a crime if you and I dismantled those boundaries that were agreed upon. If I went in and moved your boundaries, that would cause great confusion. And for the protection of the community, that was considered a crime. So, landmarks are a way of defining us. When you look at them, the necessity of every lodge when congregated should be duly tiled. Makes some sense. If our Grand Lodge had went ahead and said there are 7 landmarks, and you came up with the 8th, what then? And you came up with the 9th, what then? Have we missed a few? Well, our Grand Lodge is not in the habit of missing very much. You know what the rascals did to us? Instead of laying it out in front of us so we could read it, you and I have to reason through this. The only way we can answer this question is by doing our own homework. I don't think any of you are going to come up with the same answers as the next fella. It's your prerogative. It's your history, it's your personality, it's your curiosity. You're all absolutely right. That's what our Grand Lodge did. Now, we all respect the scholars in the room. I hope, I know. The people that have put some thought behind them. But you know, when I'm hanging around with the very oldest Masons that I know, none of them ever say that I'm wrong. They all encourage me, just like they do with you. They're curious about why you think that way. And they're always probing. They're always helping us along to learn more. This is a staggering time that we live in. No longer are we led by a wave of thought that the purpose for you and me is to develop character. Nobody says that anymore. Our schools don't do that. They've tried to equip our children so that we have people that are able to do the jobs in the future. We live in an age of celebrity. You, me, we're from another time where we look for the bigger man. And we are able to distinguish the bigger man in the crowd. A man of ethics, a man that may do something because it's the right thing to do. A man of principle, a man who keeps his own counsel. A man who troubles himself about definitions and troubles himself enough to learn about the conduct and the image of men from 600 years ago? Because we might be able to find something valuable. Freemasons are a very, very unusual lot. And in this day of celebrity, Freemasonry anchors our communities, anchors our country, and gives root and meaning to life. So all the rest of the things can go on around us at whatever speed they want. They don't have to make any sense to us. When I walk in the room with any one of you, I know the kind of man you are, and I know what you bring to the community. And that, gentlemen, is what I think the purpose of the ancient charges and the landmarks was intended to do. Thank you very much. No nods, no snoring. This is good. I'll get over to it.